Hello, everybody. How you doing? It's your boy Jedi Granville, and it's a Sunday afternoon. And as you probably already know, you've seen the title of this, or you might have seen a day before a little snippet of what I was going to bring to the table about a certain subject that sometimes is discussed, but not in great detail. And I'm hopefully I will do it in great detail. But as I say, we're going to be talking about the 80s. And with the 80s, how did it affect so many things, as far as the music, pretty much politics, the styles, the movies, television, all these things, you know. But with that, we're going to put into the what I'm going to put in the context of saying the 80s as insane or over the top or just lavish as it was of a decade, you can easily say, or at least I can say from my point of view, it was something that literally the first half of the decade was totally different from the latter half of the decade. It's almost like you were living two different 80s vibe, and yet they were still 80 bound and connected to one another. It's weird how that is, but unless you were born during that time or at least living it through as a young child like myself or someone who's a young, um, pretty much a young adult, just starting in their 20s and moving on up, then you would understand or kind of get the hint of it. You see these things. But that is what we're going to discuss. And as I mentioned in my previous video, I'm going to break this down into two videos. In other words, I'm going to start with the first video, which is this, dealing with from 1980 to 84. Because that, in a way, is where we see the 80s roll in and pretty much process what we're looking at. And then the next one would pretty much be 85, 89 after that. But before I get started, I just want to give a good shout out to a couple of people who live in Florida, like my brother, Charles Ross. He and his family went through several hurricanes, and from what I saw, a couple of tornadoes touching down in Florida. I mean, that's something that's never been, heard of, but I mean, I guess anything's possible. And I want to give a shout out to Gojiro 851. Hey, brother, I hope you're doing go well. And Jose Primo, brother, hope you're doing well this also, because, hey, the Sci-Fi Society, Mel Tavern, all that, anybody who's, like this, stick together. The struggle is real, but we never forget. So, with that in mind, let's get started. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I don't know how long this is going to be. I mean, it could be 15, 20 minutes. Hell, it could be almost an hour. But let's start with what we feel kind of generate what the 80s is and go from there. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I'm pretty much a 70s baby. I was born, here's a shirt that says, pretty much whatever he was when he was born in, which I was born in 1970. That's where I was born. I know that's mean I'm old, but I'm still here to tell the tale. And the tale is of what the 80s I feel was what was so special about it. And there's so many things. But let's kind of start with something that's, I ain't gonna say simple, but I could say influenced everything else as part as, web music and whatever. And that's what we're going to start with, music. Let's start with the fact that with music, it came into its own because I know with me, I started in the 70s, listening just strictly, everything, well, let's just say black. Everything was black. Everything was this, because I'm from the South, and that's pretty much what it was. I didn't really hear no predominantly music that was done by white artists or anything like that. In fact, this would be a stepping stone where I would listen to pretty much, the first time hearing, rock and roll, or to be more precise, heavy metal. Heavy metal was something I'd never heard of until the 80s got started. And when I started hearing this, I was kind of like, what is this music? I mean, where have I been? Where has it been all my life? Because I'm thinking, like, as a black person, you're not supposed to listen to this. But I'm a kind of person who's out thinking the box, looking outside the box, wondering what other things are, influential in what's so. So, music, you know, heavy metal, but not just heavy metal. It was the beginning of also rap music. Rap music or R&B music, but we'll say rap right now. It was starting to build up more and more. And not to get too far away from what I'm saying is, with metal incorporates rap. And what's funny is both rap and metal sort of, can kind of go together a little bit, like peanut butter and jelly. I don't know how, I don't know why, but they kind of do. They both have this message of so much not a rebellion, but kind of an influence of how you see things around you. And with certain artists like Def Leppard, you know, you know, uh, Motley Crue. I don't even know if anyone will remember Rat. Rat was one of those groups that really hit it out the ballpark. And the thing is, these groups, were influential, and I'm pretty sure they helped out with rap. Rap, we could go into a mini time a tirade of who comes up out of the box with this. Run DMC comes to mind, you know. Kumo D definitely comes to mind, and one of the ones that no, he didn't come out yet, but he was coming. I was gonna say LL Cool J, but he come later. Um, Not Kumo D. I mean, Kumo D was coming out, but others like the guys who gave us, the message, the Furious Five and all that. These individuals kind of shape, the message of what was going on, especially during the beginning of the '80s. And I don't know if anyone remembers this too well, but I know for me, I know a friend of mine, my brother DJ Anubis, and another well-known person in the Godzilla community, which I'll give a special shout out because his mom is special. Daniel Miller's mom, Deborah Miller, who I can say, hey, English sold my sister. But to what I'm saying is that if you saw these things and kind of begin to look at how when we got out of the 70s, you see that paradigm shift of what we were from the 70s. It's like you get into the 70s and the music was slightly different than what we heard, you know, back in the 70s. I mean, it was somewhat, conservative, but as the music got into the 80s more and more, you start to see or feel that less and less in the music we heard, because some of the stuff I wouldn't even notice that some of that stuff was more, you know, bringing to the table something that's like, oh, this is what they're saying, this is what is going on, and it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of, but at the same time, it was influential, and when you're young, you're not really taking account of all that. When you get older, you might notice this, but for me, the music was something tangible to what was being felt, especially around that time. And the great thing about this is that it would lead to something that we didn't have in the 70s, or at least I didn't notice it. But in terms of, it was called short films. But when we got into the 80s, it would become known as music videos. And music videos would actually help to spread or kind of get your mind of what this music sounds like or what the artist looks like who gave us these things. And I know when we first got cable, you know, we didn't get MTV, and MTV was the thing that really started. But we had other channels that actually broadcast, music videos. And one of the great things about music videos is that the first one I ever saw, and I'm pretty sure some of my people who are watching this who are the Gen Xers, the ones who really came up during the time when Vietnam, oil shortages, all these things going on in the 70s. When we get into the 80s, we remember when this video came out, and if you did see it at the time, then you'll know what I'm talking about. And then that is video killed the radio star, which is kind of ironic because you think that the video is going to kill that particular medium, which we hear on video, which we hear on records, on vinyl, cassettes, and eventually CDs. But CDs were coming out, but they were not just, yeah. Actually they were. They came out in '82. The first audio disc came out in '82. But how these things influence everything else around us would come into play with, the style of things. This is the thing. Style seemed to influence everything else. And I'm thinking this is what it is about the 80s. They influenced, everything else influenced everything else. And what music definitely influenced the most, I feel, was the fashion of the time, and especially back in this early time, the fashion was something crucial to what we saw, especially if you're, like I say, especially if you're a young child becoming a teenager. And when I got into my teens, it really blew up. It exploded. You saw a lot of what I call, and I'm pretty sure, like I say, I'm pretty sure Anubis and Barry Dever remember this. Remember the spiked hair come out? And I don't know where this come out of, but you saw a lot of these teenagers, having the hairstyles, and sometimes mohawk top. And the funny thing is, you did have mohawks like Mr. T, at the time when he was around, real popular. You saw that kind of style, and then you saw things like the like I say, with the music influencing everything else. You saw with Michael Jackson how his music influenced these typical, wares and whatnot, and how that influenced that, coming out of the gate. And then we have to look at something like Madonna. Let's look at Madonna. She and I feel Cyndi Lauper really, and I can also say the Culture Club, or most precise, Boy George, how they influenced pretty much the females of the time, female teenagers of the time, how they influenced the way they dress, with this very, very over the top, very sparkly, not so much sparkly, but very color coordinated, very, it was so, I say, like I say, me as a teenager, me as a young boy growing up at that time, I saw all these things explode, and they come out just like I say out the gate running with this stuff, and I'm feel that when those things came out, it was something that really honed in to say, okay, this is different than what the 70s or even the 60s were projectingly was. The '60s was, well, and you could say '50s too, teeny bopper, kind of shoe sign kind of dances and everything. And '70s, it was more disco, more laid back, and more soul, kind of, and it was a kind of thing going on. And I'll get to that soon enough, but it would really influence how things were affected around everything else. And music really influenced the style of some of the clothing we were wearing. And it was something amazing that, you just felt this as a certain change from when we previously left the '70s. The '70s was something totally different. And you feel like, okay, this can never be any different than what we're going to find out when we get into another decade. And me being a young kid, I was oblivious to these things. I'm thinking I'm not going to feel no different than what I am now going into another decade. And I was kind of like, hesitant and thinking that this will never happen. But then again, I was a child. I didn't know any better. So you jump into 80. 80 started out with so many things. And one of the things that started out that you saw coming, well, I say saw coming, but never imagined, was certain events that just kind of put a stamp on the 80s. One being like the unfortunate, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and feeling like this almost seems like a movie, But one of the things I realized watching, excuse me, one of the things I realized watching events that was going on is that you think they're just movies, and you know what? I'll just jump into the movies, but I'll no, but in fact, I won't say jumping into the movies. I'll say what life would help imitate. Well, I'll say imitate, help art more than life, because art always says imitates life, but life was the one thing that influenced art. And Mount St. Helens, like that, and like pretty much, the event of when uh the event of AIDS would come into play. It would affect a lot of things, and people were becoming, more self-aware about what was being brought to light and what was being, aware of, because, people were doing whatever under the sun, but when this new virus came into play, it changed the way we look at things, and it's kind of amazing how those things, you know, they did give weight to certain films and how they influence films. I mean, though, going into this, we can mention that certain uh, outcomes of wars were going on, like the war in Grenada. It happened in '83, but it didn't last. And we're coming off the tail end of, I mean, 5 or 6 years from when Vietnam ended. It influenced things, or brought us the awareness of war more often than we thought it did. And remind yourself of this. This is the beginning of when we begin to see the legendary character of Rambo, John Rambo, in the First Blood movie. And he was really the catalyst of starting something where get you involved or get you invested in what is all this about, in terms of, you know, was war really something that we was dangled with, or did we not know what war was? And I know for me, I was so henceforth thinking that, oh, we're safe, we're okay. But one of the things that will open my eyes to, and it did, was the fact we was living a war, but it was the quiet war. It was the silent war, which I feel is more deadly than a combative one that's put into action, and that was the Cold War. And the Cold War, unfortunately, it influenced a lot of things, or brought to mind of a lot of people. Because let's face it, the Cold War showed, and I know it showed for me because I can tell this story real quick and going into what I'm talking about. When I was told or given an impression of how two nations would go at each other through nuclear combat, there was a moment where I was extremely terrified, extremely frightened by this notion. I mean, I was young. I hadn't experienced anything in the world yet. I'm a young teenager. I was like, why would somebody want to blow everything up? Why would we go to war with one another? But you discover that human beings, are, just combative, animalistic in some sense of the word. And I'm talking about people, not persons. And I had believe it or not, I couldn't sleep one night. And I was so afraid that the countries of America and Russia would go to war. And, well, that ended all pretty much it. But I slept after some presence told me, it's like, son, do not worry about these things. Do not, be fearful of these things. Do not, just know that you're young, you have your whole life ahead of you, and you do not need to be concerned about these things. And I slept after that. I don't want to try to get too religious with this, but I felt the presence of the Almighty at that moment. And this is truly something that happened to me when I was like 13 years old. And this was at the tail end time when, there were so many influences about, war happening, nuclear deficiency coming into play. And you had movies that were coming out at this time, like Threads. It's a British, television movie that deals with, the before and aftermath of nuclear war. And of course, I'm pretty sure people know about this movie, the day after, which deals with that, cautionary tale about when war comes into play, using nuclear weapons, and how it devastates everything. And the aftermath of it is so, devastating. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because that was something that was really heavy-handed, extremely right there during the 80s. The notion that we could annihilate one another. And this was so brought out in things like war games, what I mentioned about days after, the day after and whatnot, Threads, and how they would give us a light, maybe to change these things so we wouldn't do the unthinkable, because we had enough bombs, we had enough weaponry to annihilate us 3 times, 4 times over. And the way that was going, these individuals would take what was being brought to light and try to say, look, let's try to talk our governments down from doing the most unthinkable things, because if we do, the human race is messed up as it is. I'm just say the human race is fucked as it is, but we can't allow our emotions overwhelm our thought process, and what will we do to our future generations? And we can't do that. We shouldn't do that. But getting to that, how, the politicals, the war, things like that brought to eyes of, this is something that wasn't being brought to light in terms of, or I wasn't recognized because I was too young to understand how what we had in the 70s would come into the 80s and really start to affect us with what we felt could be the end, but thankfully it never came in terms of being total annihilation. And when I get into the next half of the decade, you'll still see that pattern of that being brought in, being influenced with some things, and someone director wise really bring this to light. But we'll get there. We'll get there. But being that it is, 80s, I could say is pretty much those is a decade that influenced a lot of things, and movies is no exception either. And I mentioned a couple, but now I'm going to kind of mention how, well, like I say, movies, they were a dime a dozen. You had your sci-fi, you had your horror, you had your comedy, and you definitely had your drama. And what's funny is that whatever movies came out at that time, they influenced something else or was talked about something else in the another stage of form whatsoever. And sometimes the movies would influence the television series that was on at the time, and vice versa. Television shows would influence movies, and sometimes it would influence the the movies itself also. And it's kind of weird how each thing, and I think this is what I'm kind of bringing to light, is that everything was influencing everything else, but it was still coherent by not, throwing it off track. Whereas, like it's in the 70s, you have things going on, and movies were self-contained, music was self-contained, and anything, but it didn't really so much affect it as much. Here, the 80s, you had things that were, just pretty much just in investing or digesting everything that was affecting everything else that was coming out at that time. And one of the things I realized, at that time, it still stands to say that when we had movies like Empire Strikes Back or Superman 2 or E.T., and whatnot, you would have things that were coming out of there that would be said that would influence things on song or, TV or anything. Like what I'll give you, like as I aforementioned, the E.T. thing. E.T. came out, and somehow, as I mentioned with Michael Jackson, how his music and whatnot, his influence of doing the moonwalk and whatnot, influenced, you know, so much. E.T. influenced him to actually do a kind of a short read along imitating E.T. Because if you watch, there's a old poster or a picture of him and the puppet of E.T., in sync with one another. They'll just picture in, but this is Michael Jackson doing an imitation of E.T. Like E.T. phone home. It's like, wow, he's actually doing this. And it's weirdly weird how these things affect one another in terms of music affects this, but here's something else affecting that. Movies affect television, but television affects music. Music affects the politics, but politics affects, the movies, or the movies affects, the style. It's always ever changing. And at that time, you had multiple things that were being done, being said, and it's just a roundabout kind of thing that it amazes me that these things got put out there. And like I say, remember now, the politics of this time were very close hand because it affected everything else. But knowing that, we have someone who's saying these things and doing these things, it was being, heavily handed influence whatever is coming out of the box. Now, I'm trying to think. Well, I ain't gonna say try to think. I'm trying to pretty much say, why is this such a mental kind of thing that, you know, it really hammers into us. This is what is being affected. Well, probably because, as I mentioned before, as a Gen Xer, and anybody who was born during this time may not get it, but anyone who was born before saw that it was a change in their mind spec of what we experienced from the 70s of the decade before. And as I mentioned before, Deborah Miller, she kind of mentioned this to me, and it made sense. It was the start. It was a catalyst of the loss of innocence, in a way. We was growing up, we still have this conservative notion of what we had when we was living in the 70s. We did, we saw changes. We saw things that were going on. Everything was what it was. But we get into the 70s and into the 80s, at that time, I thought. I thought this is how I think thought process was. I really thought that I was an innocent individual in terms of I couldn't make no mistakes. I couldn't do anything like that. I couldn't, you know, say or do anything that's going to be wrong. Little did I know, if anything, the 80s taught me that I am not without fault. I'm going to make mistakes. I mean, I know that I made mistakes in terms of, getting the answer wrong, doing whatever, but at this time, early in the 80s, it really honed into me that no, you are without, fault. You you are somebody who's definitely at fault with something. And learning what I learned, it helped mold me in terms of not just what I saw around me, but knowing that you are not, you know, going to go in this, you're not going to come out of this world, squeaky clean. You're going to do some things, you're going to say some things, and unfortunately, I did things that regrettably I did in my early '80s youth that I'm not proud of. You know, looking back, I mean, I used to think I was somewhat semi innocent, but it turns out I was never innocent. I was just another in a cog of individuals breathing, living, and knowing what I saw, knowing what I heard, knowing what I experienced. Things of the early 80s taught me, I know for myself, I'm not sure about others, as I mentioned the ones before, if it influenced them and made them aware, and in fact, it gave them sense of awareness of that you have to be on the up and up of who you are. And early 80s specifically, it made me see things that I never really imagined unless, well, then again, as I said, I was a little kid, I was a child, but I was becoming a young adult. And as a young adult, your awareness of a lot of things were coming to light. And one of the things I've realized is that not everything is black and white. It's not what it seems like. I mean, yes, you have all these things that are, great. They're fun, but at the same time, you are not without reproach in some ways. You are with some things that makes you, you know, kind of second guess, like, who are you? Who are you as an individual? And the 80s to me, I feel, is what made me and molded me to become the person that I am. I mean, true enough, I grew up in a very conservative light when I was in the 70s growing up. But the 80s, for me, I kind of lost my innocence in terms of knowing that maybe I wasn't never really innocent. Depending on how you look at things, depending on how you think of things. And I feel that with the 80s, with all the things that were going on, with, politically, with certain things that would, open your eyes to a lot of things, and certain, movies, television shows and whatnot, it was still a sense of, yeah, this can be fun. This still can be, not so out there, but it made you aware that you have to really, and I guess the best word to say is best way to say it is you have to grow up. You have to learn to be something other than what your child self was. And there's a scripture in the Bible that says, we have to learn to put away childish things. And it's not to say that, you're still childish or anything like that. It just means that you have to learn to accept what is being broadcast to you, or learn to accept that the world is not, you know, bowl of cherries, old trope of a saying there. It's not, you know. The 80s pretty much is something that gives you, at least it gave me. I'm hoping that it gave, like, I kind of told this to the Nubis, it's like, maybe, hopefully this is something that helped mold you, because like him, like me, like others who are coming into this decade, we've all had a story to tell. We've gone through a certain, roughness and whatnot. And the thing is that with the 80s, especially the early 80s, it made me more conscious of who is, and I'll just say with me, my real name, Walter Ross, who am I? And with all the things that were going on, as I said, politically, financially, and, spiritually, who are you? Who are you as an individual? Who are you as a person? Who are you in this, amazing arena of incredible individuals? And like I say, the music, the movies, television, the things around you, the people you interact with, it gave way, I know for me, to really say, okay, what is the next step in order to really gain and really understand what is being brought to this as, an individual who's trying to just survive, just trying to learn, trying to understand what is being brought to you, In the 80s is, especially the early times, it kind of if you're trying to break it down, what seems to be, as I said, it's not always. I mean, I take, for example, what I said about earlier when I said about Empire Strikes Back, my favorite Star Wars film, I might say. What I feel is true with everything before, at least to what the 80s is now, what it was then. What I thought was concrete in terms of the 70s. The 70s, I mean, the 80s truly breaks apart what you may not believe or want to believe. And the moment is when Darth Vader says to Luke, "No, I am your father." Can I just say that I was in disbelief, that I didn't believe I heard when he said that. I was only 10 years old when I saw this film. And when I found out, when I saw Return, when I not saw it, but when someone saw Return of the Jedi and said, "Did you know Darth Vader is Luke's father?" I was like, "What? He is?" I didn't believe that. But as it turns out, I actually already heard this. I heard him say it when I saw it in the theater. But this is the thing I'm talking about. This is the thing I'm bringing to light, is that the 80s like that moment with Luke in disbelief. I was in disbelief. I was in disbelief of what I was saw or taught or looked at beforehand, but get something thrown at me and it does a whole 180 and said, no, this is not even what this is. We are not what you think it is. This is not what you think life is. Life is not what is so, you know, it's a lot of complications. And like with like I mentioned, Empire Strike Back, like Superman 2, like I think no, like say ET something. No, basically what it is, not everything was color coded, not everything was rosy sunshine. You had things like the Force, you had things like school beatings, you had things like drug taking, you had things, all these things were something that I felt like, okay, this is not real and it's not going to affect me. It turns out they were. Things were affecting us, but sometimes we didn't allow it because we didn't think that our world is getting destroyed. The belief of what we saw as a society, of the world that we lived in, was getting shattered. But as it turns out, it was just an example of showing that we can't live in a bubble of thinking that this is the life that is. And one of the things I realized coming into the 80s, the beginning of it, you have to learn to take with and make it who you are as an individual. And the crazy thing is that that was the thing, the catalyst that made me realize, Walter, or anybody else who's my generation, life is what you make of it, but it's not perfect either. Only you have the strength, the power, the drive to make it what you want. And if anything, the beginning of the 80s really honed into that beginning of with me, because I was losing my innocence. And I think that's something that Deborah mentioned, that I feel like that's exactly true. And I hadn't thought about that until I realized that's exactly what I went through. I went through a loss of innocence that I didn't realize, but at the same time, it made me realize this is helping to mold who I am, who is Walter Ross, and whoever else at the time was living, who they are. And hopefully it brings to light something that we'll deal with in the future, you know. But so many things are coming out and so many things were influenced, but it's those things that started me on my way. And these things were, like I say, these were things that shaped and molded, the beginning of the 80s. But as you find out, when we leave 84, when I step into 85, it's like, what is this? Something's a little tangibly different here. And I couldn't understand what that was. It was like, this is different. But that is the thing right there, what I'm going to get into in the next part, because this is just part one of my discussion. Hopefully it didn't throw you off, but at least kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about as far as 80s and how it is what it was and how it just kind of affected us, especially, like I say, my generation, and maybe the children who came up in during the 80s. But that being said, I'm going to end this here with the part one. Part two will be coming up very soon, and it'll finish it off. I mean, I'll put it like this: like the 80s, it's funny. Like the 80s, when sequels came out, and this is the time when sequels really bombarded us a lot. I don't know if this part two will be better than the first one. I mean, if it is, so be it. If it's not, then it's a standalone and say, okay, it is what it is, but it's going to be totally different. And this right here is a different tone of what the beginning of the video of the journey of the 80s is. So the next journey will be totally different, but at the same time, be unique, like the decade. So, with that being said, I'm going to close it out, and hopefully you enjoyed this. I mean, like I say, if you got what I was saying, you know, talking about this, I hope I did good to you. But if it didn't, you know, hey, it's more structure to this than you might think it is, and hopefully you just realize that this is what the 80s was, just like any other decade. It helped you think beyond what you thought you knew. And that's what I learned from that. So, in closing, as I always do in my videos, I will always say, y'all will take care. Be patient always. I mean, because you have to be with the world we live in right now. But also, keep that kaiju love alive. And I'll see y'all soon.